UB News, what up? All praise to the Most High. Much love to all my followers who have been showing me love and encouragement in the comments. Much love to everyone who has donated. Trust and believe, I really appreciate it, guys. And I just want to say big shout out to YouTube for deleting over 1,000 of my subscribers. I mean, seriously, y'all take rectum singe to a whole new level, B. How is a whole corporation threatened by a nigga who makes videos on his cell phone? To the point y'all literally hide my videos from other people's playlists and delete my videos with no notification. You've unsubscribed thousands of people. I've had hundreds of people send me messages that YouTube has unsubscribed me again multiple times. And anytime I drop a new video, that's the time my subscribers get dropped. Just stop it, YouTube. Just stop it, YouTube. Y'all ain't gonna win. Alphabet fuckboy face ass cyber thug face ass niggas. Brought to your knees by a nigga on a Samsung Galaxy Note 4. You guys ain't even good at hiding lies. Oh, I got some fucking lying. Come on, bruh. Nobody flagged my video. A million murder mixtapes on YouTube, but y'all mad at a dude with some old maps. Pull down your skirt, YouTube. Your twat's waving in this direction. Smells like calcified Khazarian cavefish. Ugh. Ugh. So anyway, today we're going to be talking about TimeLies, the false chronology of world history. So let's go ahead and set the stage. We're going to be analyzing research from a Russian scientist. His name is Anatoly Fomenko. He's the author of New Chronology, History, Fact or Fiction. In short, Fomenko claims that Roman Jesuits and Benedictine monks created and fabricated over 1,000 years of history during the Middle Ages and Dark Ages. So basically it asserts that the timeline has been dramatically altered by up to 1,000 years, which means that the time of supposed Christ wasn't 2,000 years ago, but rather 1,000 years ago, which means the fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD happened during the Crusades. But also, Fomenko claims Jerusalem is not where we currently think it is. Again, he says Jerusalem is not where we think it is. Instead, he says Jerusalem is actually Moscow, Russia. I've been personally saying that these heathens have been lying about the timeline for a couple of years now. Especially once I got into reading and studying Torah, I understood that there has been a major deception perpetrated on the entire world. And in fact, the Torah is a historical reference guide. I've studied classical history for a long time, even in college. I was a history and journalism major. And one thing I've always found unnecessarily confusing is the BCE AD CE timeline. I never understood the purpose of the year zero being arbitrarily placed at a fictional midpoint in human existence based upon the life of a human who didn't exist.
Series of popular science films. History. Fact or fiction. This film contains material from the new chronology of Fomenko Nasovsky. The makers of the film express their thanks to Fomenko and Nasovsky. He who controls the past controls the future. George Orwell, 1984. The central book of Christianity, the Bible, contains many secrets. One of them is the construction of Jerusalem, described in the Old Testament in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. These books tell us that Jerusalem was captured by troops of the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar and was totally destroyed, but was restored 70 years later. However, the Bible does not tell us whether Jerusalem was rebuilt on the same spot where it stood before being destroyed by the Babylonian army. Another fact is curious. It is well known that there have been several versions of the Bible. In different versions, there are different descriptions of the rebuilding of Jerusalem. For example, in the canonical synodal translation of the Bible, published in the 19th century, the story of the rebuilding of Jerusalem uses the word repair for the restoration. They repaired the walls. They repaired the gates. Yet in older versions of the Bible, published in the 16th century, they use the word create or build. It seems that in an older version of the Bible, the book of Nehemiah directly and exactly describes the construction of a completely new Jerusalem and not the restoration of the former destroyed city. The later editors of the Bible needed this slight change from the word build to the word repair in order to convey that Jerusalem was rebuilt on the site of the former capital city and not in a new location. But that leaves us with the question, where exactly was Jerusalem built?
So I'm just going to read an article, and this is kind of like an introduction to new chronology. It just gives you an idea of what we're going to be researching and looking into. So this article is at blackbag.gawker.com, and it's titled, "Is Ancient History Completely Made Up by the Man?" Assume a notable story on a notable day in history, the lunar landing, say was fabricated. Now assume that 400,000 to 2 million such days were concocted. You begin to get a sense of the scope of new chronology, the empirico-statistical theory that much of human history is a fiction assembled to serve the powerful. Can you recall your middle school social studies lessons? How at some willowy point in your 11th or 12th grade year you learned that recorded history begins with the appearance of writing? There were the Mesopotamians in their cuneiform, the Egyptians in their hieroglyphs, and then Demotic scrolls. And later, the Greeks and Romans, whose societies formed the backbone, for better or worse, of our own, if only because they kept such meticulous records. We have all sought and found these connections to our past in museums and books, in the ground. This is our inheritance, and it is ingrained in us so clearly, so matter-of-factly, that it permeates most of our existences without demanding critical reflection. But what if it's all bullshit? Anatoly Fomenko would like to blow your mind now, please. He will be assisted by chess grandmaster Garry Kasparov as well as Sir Isaac Newton. Okay. Since 1980, Fomenko, a mathematician at Moscow State University. Moscow State sounds like a HBCU in Russia, a black Russian university, but it's not. Just Moscow State just sounds black. Moscow State, a full member of Russia's prestigious Academy of Sciences, has been the leading proponent of a radical revision of human history, an improved version of the global chronology of the ancient time. As he and collaborator Gleb Nosovsky put it, based on statistical and astronomical analyses. Fomenko believes there's no reliable written record of human events before the 11th century. Most of our knowledge of earlier cultures is based on text or copies of texts that date from after that era. From that point on, chroniclers, primarily learned religious scholars, used supposition and arbitrary consensus to fix the dates of key events in history. In doing so, they grafted recent occurrences onto earlier dates, sometimes unwittingly, sometimes perniciously, thus creating numerous historical duplicates. History appears to repeat itself, Fomenko suggests, because it's been thoroughly plagiarized. In his chronology, the events of the New Testament precede those of the Old Testament, and in any case, most of the stories are concocted to reflect later incidents. Joan of Arc was a model for the biblical character Deborah. Jesus Christ was crucified in Constantinople in 1086. Ancient Egypt, Rome, and Greece were fashioned by Renaissance writers and artists. The time of the pharaohs, Fomenko suggests, may have lasted until the 1700s. Aristotle instructed Alexander the Great, who was a czar in Moscow in the 1400s. Wow. Aristotle instructed Alexander the Great, who was a czar in Moscow in the 1400s. That's very interesting. I don't know about that, but you're going to see that this is going to take a very Russian swing. Early English history, from the accepted names and dates to the apocryphal legends of a post-Roman King Arthur, is actually a carbon copy of 4th century Byzantium, which itself a fiction based on late medieval events. Speaking of carbon, don't bother relying on carbon dating or other scientific chronological methods. Fomenko says they are premised on the old dating system and hence thoroughly corrupted. Skipping ahead here. But until science became, well, a science, certain imprecision was baked into the effort. Ancient cultures could preserve the passage of time through astronomy, tracking the movements of the sun, the moon, and the stars. But how they affixed these events on a timeline varied wildly. Even within a single culture, political and religious upheavals brought new timelines. Within 2 millennia, according to the old history, the one Fomenko challenges, citizens of Rome recognized 3 different calendars: the Roman, the Julian, and the Gregorian. The more time passes, the more necessary it becomes for a chronicler to reconcile all of these disparities. Hedgewish said, to determine with precision the quantity or duration of the natural divisions of time is the business of the astronomer or of the mathematical chronologist. On the other hand, the civil or arbitrary divisions of time are matter of mere historical knowledge. Yet the mathematical chronologist cannot speak of the divisions of time nor give their precise duration without availing himself to the civil divisions. Mathematical and historical chronology are so far, therefore, inseparably connected. Quote from that article: "That system, as he explains it, is of a band of dishonest fabulists organized and disciplined in the use of the pen, taught to agree upon a dogma and fable. From their hands came the whole of our Christian literature, the whole of our history, arranged to suit their purposes." So you see what the New York Times tried to do. Obviously, after his death, they go in and they try to discredit the person in their research. Back to Fomenko. On the surface, at least, Fomenko's theory has advantages over earlier chronologists. He uses statistical analysis to correlate old dates and timelines, seeking convergences and similarities that have escaped the notice of others. He harmonizes an abundance of celestial data and finds that astronomical events attributed to antiquity seem to correspond with more recent recorded events. So basically, he's using astronomical dating, and he's backdating based on the constellations and written events throughout history. Except that this data aren't all that harmonious. In his reliance on early astronomical dating, when there is a conflict between Ptolemy's recording of a celestial event and the existing historical record, Fomenko doesn't assume Ptolemy got it wrong, even though we know about Ptolemy. Ptolemy's a charlatan. He doesn't assume Ptolemy got it wrong. He simply concludes that Ptolemy lived 700 years later than historians believed. That's interesting, but why does his map look like that? Let's not talk about it. To make his smooth charts correlate earlier and later epochs in history, he has to be selective in picking his data points. Is there an unpleasant hump in this curve? Maybe those two kings were really one king. See how nicely that flattens things out. Take, for example, Fomenko's assertion that Jesus and Pope Gregory were really the same person. That's interesting. Duplicated into the historical record about 100 years apart, with Christ living in the Middle Ages. To make this case, Fomenko spends an entire chapter correlating the astronomical record with the events described in the Gospels, yet he never addresses the glaring differences in the two men's biographies, like how Christ was executed in his 30s, while Pope Gregory died of old age and in exile while in his 60s. The Pope Gregory thing is very interesting, though. For anybody who's seen the Dumb Diversus video, we mentioned Pope Gregory, Dumb Diversus, and being able to capture under some sort of law under the Pope, capture all the land south and west of the Cape Verde Islands. There's also this thing about how the whole of humanity before the Renaissance was basically dominated by Mother Russia. We're going to get into that. We're going to look at some snippets from a documentary, and we're going to show you where he's trying to make correlations between Moscow and Jerusalem. And he's using astronomical dating, saying that Moscow could have been the only city that could have been built during this time in history. And he's using the book of Nehemiah, and he's saying that the Nehemiah book happened in the 15th and the 16th century. The only time and the only cities that were being built, the most major city that was being built at the time was Moscow. But of course, he's conveniently forgetting about another half of the world. Not to mention that several prophecies have already stated that Jerusalem would be barren, but that is neither here nor there, because we're going to talk about it later.
Didn't the entire history of humankind ever strike you as illogical? The documented history of human civilization is supposed to reach several millennia back into the past. And yet, if we consider the rate at which civilization is supposed to have progressed, we encounter periods of obscurity and informational vacuum following the alleged decline of every ancient empire. And then everything starts anew. Inventions are presumed lost for centuries, then reinvented by people whose names bear suspicious semblance to those of the ancient inventors. Just how true all of this is? Could history as we know it really be a collation of several chronicles relating to one and the same period of time? Apparently, this is what the Russian mathematician Anatoly Fomenko claims. He is the author of the first volume in a series of 7 that came out in English recently, and generated incredible controversy amongst professional historians worldwide. However, all of his work conforms to the highest academic standards and is backed by solid scientific facts. Furthermore, some of the most lucid minds of our time support many of the theories put forward by the authors. Garry Kasparov, the world chess champion, says the following in his preface to Volume 1. Documented history tells us of the insatiable need of human beings to make discoveries. The vector of technological progress is a strictly vertical one. Every 10 years something happens, discoveries, sea voyages, explosions, everything keeps on changing. We see constant evolution, from Columbus to the landing on the moon, from crossbows to nuclear bombs. Forwards and upwards. However, the traditional ancient history tells us of periods when humanity apparently remained dormant for centuries. Ancient Egypt, the medieval Dark Ages hold epochs of utter stasis in human thinking. It appears that the inhabitants of ancient Egypt and Rome had a different genetic code, and couldn't be bothered about anything at all, so they froze in their development, the result being a total lack of innovative activity. At the same time, there had been prosperous ancient empires where those among Homo sapiens who possessed penchants for arts and sciences could get plenty of opportunities for growth and development. But, alas and alack, all of the prosperous ancient empires had ceased their development at some point.
This book will change your entire perception of history forever. What if ancient Rome, Greece, and Egypt were invented during the Renaissance? What if the Old Testament was a rendition of events in the Middle Ages? What if Jesus Christ was born in 1053 and crucified in 1086 AD? Sounds unbelievable? Not after you've read History, Fictional Science by Anatoly Fomenko, the leading mathematician of our time.
Popular fiction dealing with conspiracies of one sort or another is actually quite tame as compared to reality. Dan Brown pens a possible conspiracy of the Church against the memory of its originator Jesus. He follows unknowingly in the steps of Martin Luther, who started his Protestant revolution with accusation of papal conspiracy in the matter of Constantine's testament. Well, Martin Luther was right and Constantine's testament was false. Remember, poor Martin Luther had as media outlet nothing better than the doors of the Wittenberg's cathedral. Dan Brown has mass media at his disposal. The Roman Catholic Church, for instance, is involved in a much greater hoax than the most daring writer could possibly conceive of, one that deals with the very foundations of history itself. The above statement is neither an exaggeration, nor a metaphor. Very few people are aware that the BC-AD chronology as we know it was created by a handful of Jesuits in the 16th-17th century, Joseph Scaliger, Dionysius Petavius and their successors. We have grown so accustomed to a timeline that runs through many millennia, from the Egyptian pyramids to the present day, that the mere thought of questioning its veracity seems perfectly preposterous, just like the notion of a rotating Earth must have seemed in the epoch of Galileo Galilei, and just as heretical. But nevertheless, the entire conception of ancient and medieval history known to us today owes its existence to a 16th century Jesuit hoax. A hoax that has finally been exposed with the aid of astronomy, mathematical statistics and modern computational facilities by one of the world's leading mathematicians, the Russian academician Professor Anatoly Fomenko. his fundamental work on chronology, history, fiction or science, now available in English, is more fascinating than Dan Brown at his wildest. Yet it is truly a non-fiction work. That goes to say, everything else you have read about history should probably classify as fiction.
This book will change your entire perception of history forever. What if ancient Rome, Greece and Egypt were invented during the Renaissance? What if the Old Testament was a rendition of events in the Middle Ages? What if Jesus Christ was born in 1053 and crucified in 1086 AD? Sounds unbelievable? Not after you've read History, Fiction or Science by Anatoly Fomenko, the leading mathematician of our time.
Okay, we are currently in the year 2018, but why? Because the birth of a fictional character supposedly 2018 years ago. But historically, there's no legitimate foundation for the existence of the supposed Christ. In addition to the fact that all historical evidence for such things comes from the Vatican, we have more than just cause for speculation. There are no historical manuscripts from that period of time that have survived the test of time. None. In fact, Christianity wasn't even propagated by Rome until supposedly 300 years after the death of the supposed Christ. 300 years later. But Christ, or Jesus, or Yeshua, or Yahawashi, was crucified as a Jew. But Constantine made Christianity an official religion in Rome. 300 years later. Why would heathenized Romans, who worshipped the pantheon of Greek gods, worship a Jew? What happened between the fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD and the invention of Christianity? In many ways, history would have you believe that Christians were already created or were a thing at the time of the temple siege in 70 AD. Let's go with that premise. That would mean it took less than a century after the death of Jesus for Christianity to be a full-blown religion in Rome, but another 300 years for Rome to adopt it officially as a religion? So a major question would be, what happened between the siege of Jerusalem and the invention of Christianity? From essentially 0 to 325 AD, or from 70 to 376 AD? And then what happened after the invention of Christianity, from 325 to 1066? Other than the invention of Islam, because all historical manuscripts from that period of time are non-existent. And the oldest manuscripts from any period of time all come out of the same lines from the Vatican. And who is willing to vouch for the Vatican when it comes to things of this nature? Are you?
Russian scholars Anatoly Fomenko and Gleb Nosovsky have been working for many years on a reconstruction of the real story based on a new chronology. They have studied hundreds of ancient records and documents, analyzing the text of the Bible with the help of their own original mathematical and statistical methods. The scholars reached a conclusion which confounded even them. One of the amazing facts we brought to light in analyzing the Bible is the discovery that in a well-known book of the Old Testament, the book of Nehemiah, it seems that there is a description of the Moscow Kremlin in the 16th century.
This hypothesis from the very beginning dumbfounded even us. The idea arose from purely chronological reasoning. According to our research, it appears that the biblical description of the construction of Jerusalem actually refers to the 16th century. But at that time in the history of the Middle Ages, there was only one case of the construction of a major holy city, the construction of the Moscow Kremlin. And I'd like to point out that according to our research, the Kremlin was built in the 16th century, not in the 15th century, as historians have thought, but actually a century later. A comparison of the biblical description and the description from the Middle Ages shows that it actually makes sense to consider if the biblical description is actually referring to the building of the Kremlin.
Beware of cherry picking from this point forward.
Part 1.
Russia
When was
all
Moscow
of a sudden
built?
becomes a point of focus.
At first glance, Fomenko and Nosovsky's suggestion that the Bible might describe the construction of the Moscow Kremlin sounds paradoxical. Indeed, it is generally considered that the building of Jerusalem, as described in the book of Nehemiah, occurred long before the birth of Christ, more than 2,000 years ago. What does that have to do with the building of the Kremlin? And why did these scholars conclude that the ancient fortress was built in the 16th century and not the 15th? History maintains that the white stone Kremlin of Ivan Kalita replaced the Kremlin built during the reign of Ivan III, and that it was constructed in the 15th century. But in the middle of the 16th century, at the very beginning of the reign of Ivan the Terrible, a fire destroyed the Kremlin. Therefore, Ivan the Terrible had to rebuild it. But the authors of the new chronology absolutely disagree. They are convinced that Ivan the Terrible didn't rebuild the Moscow Kremlin, but rather built it from scratch. This can be inferred from the history of the construction of the fortress walls of Moscow. It is generally accepted that the first ring of walls, that is, the walls of the Kremlin, were completed in the beginning of the 16th century. The construction of the second ring of fortress walls, called Kitai Gorod, was completed only by the year 1600. This fact deserves special attention, because for a city there is nothing more important than its defensive fortifications, even more so for a capital. According to the generally accepted historical version, it would seem that in the 15th century, both the builders of Moscow and the leaders of the government didn't understand to what degree it was necessary to build several rows of fortress walls. Wars were sweeping the countryside. Moscow had been attacked by the Crimean Khans, but Muscovites had to wait 100 years before they finally built a second fortress wall. And the third wall, Bielый Gorod, was only built in the beginning of the 17th century. It seems that the Russian rulers needed 200 years to strengthen the defenses of their city to the standards of military technology of the time. Yet in Constantinople, for example, they already had the exact same plan of 3 rings of walls. It is logical to suppose that in Moscow, the construction was carried out according to the same rules. Without such defenses, the Moscow Kremlin would have been easy prey for an enemy, but we know that in the 16th and 17th centuries, it was never attacked. There is one other curious fact. Sigismund von Herberstein, an Austrian diplomat, wrote a book called Notes on Muscovite Affairs. Baron Herberstein visited Russia twice, in 1517 and in 1529. In his book, he described in great detail his travels in Moscow and even included a detailed plan of the Moscow Kremlin. However, there doesn't seem to be any similarity between his plan and the appearance of the actual Kremlin. Anyone who has seen the Moscow Kremlin will see that the number of towers, gates, and cathedrals depicted in the plan don't match. The outer appearance also has nothing in common with reality. The only similarity is the depiction of the city at the confluence of two rivers. But according to the accepted timeline, by the time of Herberstein's travels, the construction of the Kremlin was already complete. Why then didn't the Austrian diplomat depict the Kremlin as it was, but instead some other fortress? Unfortunately, historians don't have a good answer to this question. It is thought that he simply drew a generalized plan. However, the authors of the new chronology don't see anything strange. Herberstein simply couldn't draw a correct plan of the Moscow Kremlin because at the time of his travels, it hadn't been built yet. At best, it was still being built, but hadn't yet reached its finished appearance.
This is interesting. This is about Sir Isaac Newton. This part I'm going to skip ahead here. Small wonder then that the advent of the scientific method and telescopic astronomy, along with advances in mathematics, spurred some of the earliest serious attempts to make sense of history on an all-encompassing timeline that wasn't based on religious dogma. Sir Isaac Newton seemed singularly qualified for this task, having applied his talent for mathematical reasoning to celestial physics. Newton's contribution, The Chronology of Ancient Kingdoms, first appeared in print after his death in 1728. It argued, sometimes haughtily, that the currently accepted timeline of ancient history was wildly inaccurate in places. Wow. The Chronology of Ancient Kingdoms first appeared in print after his death in 1728. So we definitely need to look at the Chronology of Ancient Kingdoms, which is interesting because we all know Sir Isaac Newton for the theory of gravity, which now in hindsight we know is retarded. But think about that. Maybe the wrong side of history could also be the right side of history. And notice we only hear about gravity. We never have ever heard about the Chronology of Ancient Kingdoms. Did anyone ever figure Isaac Newton to ever debunk chronology? I had never heard that. Interesting. Chronologers have sometimes doubled the persons of men, Newton argued, and by such corruptions they have exceedingly perplexed ancient history. The Greeks mixed goddesses with Egyptian goddesses. The Romans lost most of their chronicles to fires set by the Gauls. The Persian timeline of rulers made no sense. And how could the great Egyptian city of Memphis have existed before Homer's day if Homer never mentioned it? As a result, Newton's own countrymen were adrift, uncertain of their own location in history. The Europeans had no chronology before the times of the Persian Empire, and whatsoever chronology they now have of ancienter times, yes, it says ancienter times, hath been framed by reasoning and conjecture. Now, these are the words of Sir Isaac Newton. Newton's chronology moved the English a little closer to antiquity. Events in ancient Greece, he argued, were about 300 years newer than conventional wisdom held. Egypt's empire was moved forward in time as much as 1800 years, and so on for most ancient civilizations. And whilst all these nations have magnified their antiquities so exceedingly, the great mathematician concluded, we need not wonder that the Greeks and Latins have made their first kings a little older than the truth. About Newton, critics were unimpressed. One argued that the author had gone senile in his old age. Another shrugged that Newton failed to come up with correct judgments in everything excepting mathematics. But the father of gravitational laws was downright subtle when compared with another chronologist who lived around the same time, Jean Hardouin. The son of a bookseller, Hardouin became a Jesuit teacher and librarian who grew interested in dating classical texts he collected and translated. Hardouin's conclusion, what one later critic called a literary hallucination, was that except for a few works of Cicero, Virgil, and some others, all Greek and Roman texts of antiquity were spurious fabrications cooked up by certain monks in the 13th century. Even the Greek translation of the Bible itself was suspect to Hardouin, an assertion scandalous enough that his Jesuit superiors forced him to publicly recant his research in 1708. But he posthumously published several more texts expanding on his theory that medieval Benedictine monks had basically created classical Rome and Greece and even fabricated all ancient coins. So after being told to recant his research by the Jesuits, he still went on to publish several more texts expanding on his theory that medieval Benedictine monks basically created classical Rome and classical Greece and even fabricated coins. Quote, "Here enter upon a very important but a very invidious undertaking. It is my intention, with the assistance of God, as long as he grants me life, to show that all writings which are commonly thought to be old are in fact, with exceptions to be presently named, supposititious, and the fabrication of an unprincipled crew of literary men." Why? According to his biography, in a 1715 text entitled The Charlatary of the Learned, Hardouin only declared elliptically that when he died, the reason will be found written on a piece of paper the size of his hand. The reason, unfortunately, was never found. Yeah, I bet not. Quote, "Empire itself. In further researches, I found the whole of the earliest church literature proceeded from the cloisters of two primitive orders of Saint Basil and Saint Benedict. They and they alone were the inventors of the designation Christiani and of the whole system of ideas connected with it. Their literature was persistently annotated into times when it could not have been written." St. Paul, the early church fathers, and even the Gospels themselves were all concocted by the 1500s by Benedictine monks. Christ and the apostles were wholesale fictions, as was all English history before the end of the 15th century. And as one of his chapter titles put it, an imaginary period has been created called the Middle Ages. The entire era from 700 to 1400 never actually happened.
It's over.